Hello there, I'm Nemo, and a few months ago I made 3Depth, the first ever 3D level in Geometry Dash. Well, almost. Technically, Third Axis was the first, but I mean, come on! So, most of you probably know Geometry Dash as a game about dying to over-decorated spikes, so allow me to show you how I turned this game into a 3D engine that could compete with Unreal. Hey, this project took an enormous amount of effort, so please, leave a like and share it with your friends, it would really help a lot. The idea of making 3D in Geometry Dash isn't exactly new. It started with level Dim by Sputniks, and even I myself partook in 3D tomfoolery with levels such as Doom GD. That's right, I made Doom way before and started asking me to do it. However, before update 2.2 came out in 2023, 3D levels looked really goofy and not at all 3D. So I kept trying to come up with new rendering techniques and had a very good looking 3D engine ready to release. And then 2.2 came out. After 7 years of waiting, it came out right before I was about to release my final project, and broke all of my prototypes. Yeah, that was painful. But then, I noticed a tiny feature in the mountain of new content, the gradient trigger. You see, even though it didn't look like it at first, this trigger was so overpowered that it made an insurgence of 3D engines just a matter of time. It was so obvious, in fact, that a lot of people began prototyping 3D levels before the update even came out, such as this 3D cube by my fellow creator Lumi, which was released less than a month into the update 2.2. But even with all those levels, I already knew exactly what I wanted to make as soon as I saw the gradient trigger, and so I disregarded all other people's attempts and wrote a script that later became known as 3Depth. Here's how I did it. Believe it or not, 3D is actually really easy to make. Good 3D is hard to make. However, we're not going for good, as you could probably tell. So while the problem seemed really complex, all I needed to do was figure out just 2 steps. First was positioning the points on the screen in a way that looked 3D, and second was filling them in with color. That last part is usually the hardest one in the 3D engine, but here it's already solved for us. Remember how I mentioned that gradient triggers were overpowered? Here's why. A single trigger is enough to draw a triangle between 3 points of your choosing. That addition is really weird and doesn't suit Geometry Dash at all. However, what it does suit is 3D rendering. Almost like Rocked Up planned for it. Oh god, am I just a puppet in the hands of my creator? Anyway, the hard part comes from actually moving the points of this triangle. You see, proper 3D projection is really hard, and it is determined by a whole lot of really complicated mathematical matrices. And my viewership probably went down by 2% just now. Remember how you saw this stuff in school and thought it was useless in real life? Well, is it useless now that you're trying to make a 3D engine in Geometry Dash? Wait, shh. We don't even need these matrices. Each of them describes a step in 3D transformation, and if we can recreate this step using Geometry Dash triggers, we can get rid of the calculations altogether. I spent 2 years learning linear algebra for nothing. This first one is the narcissist matrix. It makes the player the center of the world, quite literally. The whole point of this transformation is to place the camera at 0, 0. This other one, the ratio matrix, simply scales down the faraway objects, completing the 3D look of our scene. Back in the editor, things are still looking a bit empty. The hardest part is of course figuring out where to start. And here's my idea. Remember that first transformation that makes the player the center of the world? Well, what if, instead of moving the player around the world, we move the world around the player? Here's how that works. We first create a top-down view of the scene. For now, we only need the vertices, so we simply put an object at every corner of our model. Then, we place an object in the center that represents the player. Now, whenever the player rotates or moves, we instead move the scene around that central object. This way, the first step of 3D transformation is taken care of by default. But it looks nothing like the example I showed you before. That's because for now we're constricted to 2 dimensions. We need to somehow add information about the height of objects to our scene. So, I added an extra object for every vertex in the scene, matching the desired height. Note that every object represents 1 vertex, so for this model in particular, I am adding 2 objects at every corner of the cube, because there are vertices hidden behind. Same goes for the top-down view, where every corner object is duplicated to represent the vertices at the bottom of the cube. Now that the information about all 3 dimensions is present, we need to combine everything into one picture. And look what happens when we place down a follow trigger. By copying the horizontal positions of our objects in the scene onto the screen, we now have what is called an orthogonal projection of our scene. And now, it is time to color in the faces of our model. As I said before, it is trivial with gradient triggers. We just add a gradient in vertex mode for every side of the cube, using individual vertex groups as gradient corners. And voila, we have rotating cubes. But this doesn't look 3D yet, because in the real world, everything gets smaller as it gets farther away from you. That's what the ratio transformation describes, and that's where we can use a very niche geometry dash trigger called area scale. What this trigger does is scales down a group of objects based on the distance between the center object of the group and some indicator object far away. As you can probably tell, this is very similar to the way 3D perspective works, where the relative size of the object to the observer is determined by its distance from said observer. Furthermore, we set up our top-down view in a way that makes the direction of vision always face up. So the vertical distance between the vertex and our player view is equal to the perspective factor, and we can use vertical mode in area scale to scale the object down. Now, because different vertices of the object can be at different distances when the camera rotates, we need to scale each vertex position individually rather than scaling the object as a whole. In order for area scale to work, it needs a center object. In 3D, the objects scale down towards the center of the screen, so we can put a bunch of objects in the center with a group for every vertex in our scene, and then assign those groups to vertices, one group per vertex. This way, every group contains just two objects, the center to be scaled around, and the vertex that is being scaled, which is ideal for the area trigger. Look what happens when we take the vertical position of the objects in our scene, and use area scale to scale down the object on the screen. Things suddenly gain 3D perspective. Yeah, you can make a 3D level in Geometry Dash by just spamming 3 types of triggers. No idea why people haven't done it yet. Also, in real world, things scale down with an exponentially decreasing rate, which has to be approximated with area easing functions and requiring an additional area, but that's just details. However, there's a problem with the current renderer. If we go around an object, things look weird. Objects closer to the camera are supposed to cover the ones far away, but remember that everything we're seeing are technically just 2D triangles on the screen, and so there is no such thing as one being farther away than the other, because all of them are in the same 2D plane. And so because Geometry Dash is not familiar with the concept of the third dimension, we end up with something that looks like an Escher painting. Remember that every object in our scene is represented using a gradient trigger. Well, Geometry Dash orders gradients in a very specific way, that is, the gradients that are added last are drawn on top of the others. So technically all we need to do to solve our 3-dimensional mess over here is just make sure that the things closer to the camera are added last. However, we cannot pre-order 3D things before starting the level, so we have to make an instant sorting. Since we need the face sorting to happen within a single frame, we will have to rely on the order of in-game events that happen on the same tick. One such event is collision detection. Luckily, Geometry Dash has collision blocks, which make calling collision events very easy. So, in order to make it instant, I used the very weird property of Geometry Dash collision blocks. You see, if two dynamic collision blocks share a collision ID, then they detect collisions in a very specific order. The ones that were added latest detect the collisions after the older ones. On top of that, within a single dynamic block, static collisions are detected in a roughly left to right order. When things start moving, the order will break, so we need to toggle off the dynamic blocks after a single tick of time with a collision trigger, and do it 20 times every second to keep the order up to date. So, if we had a lot of dynamic collision blocks in a line, making sure that the ones to the right are placed after the ones to the left, then we add a static collision blocks to every single face in our scene, then use area triggers to rotate and squash them in order to fit in the ray, and finally make sure that every collision call corresponds to a single gradient, we obtain a roughly sorted view of our scene. Yes, it is about as complicated as it sounds, and yes, I did spend about 5 hours trying to figure it out. Shut up, I don't have a problem. As you can probably tell, at this point placing triggers was becoming very tedious, and I would literally have to place tens of thousands of them in order to display all the vertices in 3 depth. Clearly, I needed a way to automate it, and so I spent the next few days writing a tool called Nedit, which decrypts Geometry Dash level saves to modify them directly, and with that, I could place thousands of triggers in a couple of seconds, easily converting 3D models into Geometry Dash levels. But believe it or not, that's literally all it takes to make a basic 3D engine in Geometry Dash. Follow triggers, area scale, gradients, and some collision blocks and logic can combine to produce an explorable 3D world. Finally, I can make a 3D level in Geometry Dash! I said, about 10 days into development. The project took about 3 to 4 months, by the way. Here are just some of the things that I had to add afterwards. Complicated scripts that reset the scene reusing the same vertices to improve performance. Multiple methods of depth sorting to give the user finer control over visual glitches. Face sorting suborder that allows you to add detail to walls. Optimization methods that change the engine completely on top of reinventing statistics. And about a billion other little things. And after that, I was ready to start making the level. So, I planned out the gameplay, I made all the levels in Blender, gradually adding detail and moving objects. And finally, I made all the object and the UIs in Geometry Dash. And with that, 3Depth was ready to release. I'd be lying if I said that I expected much from this release. Too many of my mega projects never passed 1,000 downloads. So you can probably imagine my surprise when I woke up the next morning to a legendary rating and tens of thousands of downloads. There was also a holy crusade against Geometry Dash rating system, but I mean, at this point it's kind of a tradition, isn't it? I'll take this opportunity to say thank you for all the amazing comments and feedback. That really meant a lot. However, the feeling of satisfaction was slightly dampened when I realized that I spent about 4 years to get those 4 creator points. But we don't talk about that. The level was finally complete, the goal has been achieved once and for all. I could finally relax. The rough estimate is that the library will be made public in the next few weeks, along with a comprehensive tutorial. Thank you again for... Nemo, where are you? Yeah, about that. Depending on when you're watching this, the scripts for 3Depth are probably already up on GitHub. At the moment, I still have to write some documentation, but that will be taken care of soon. And I know that it took me about 6 months to actually get around to doing this, but if I can just get you to take a look at this, and a bit of this, and maybe some of that. Yeah, starting YouTube while doing university full-time was not the brightest idea. Anyway, eternal suffering aside, I have not been idle in these past few months and have quite a few exciting projects coming up, so subscribe so that you don't miss them. As usual, please like this video and share it with your friends. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this little rollercoaster of insanity. I have been Nemo, and I'll see you soon.